The Holy Gospel is written in the 13th chapter according to St. Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
At that very hour, some Pharisees came and said to Jesus, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you." Jesus said to them, "Go and tell that fox for me, 'Listen, I am casting out demons and performing cures today and tomorrow, and on the third day I finish my work. Yet today, tomorrow, and the next day I must be on my way, because it is impossible for a prophet to be killed outside of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you. And I tell you, you will not see me until the time comes when you say, 'Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord.'" Here ends the reading of the Holy Gospel, the word of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You may be seated. I love the front of the bulletin today, that big old hen protecting your chicks. I've seen on some different Pinterest or different posts that there are pictures of hens, and when they kind of lift their wings a little bit, little kittens crawl out. So apparently hens aren't real picky about who they'll protect, so even not of their kind, they will keep them warm. So here's a question for you. Have you ever had a family member or a friend who was just having a terrible time in their life? And they maybe had a relationship with the Lord, but most likely not. And they were making mistake after mistake and terrible choices, and there just didn't seem to be anything that you could do about it. You might try to give them some advice, but they weren't going to listen. They wanted to do it their own way, even if it was wrong. And they moaned and they groaned and they continued to struggle and choose wrong paths until finally, about all you could do was just stand and watch. And you know that frustrating pain that's in the middle of your heart when you want things to be good for them, but they just continue down a path that is just leading to all kinds of misery. They just won't listen. So you do your level best after withholding, wanting to smack them upside the head to get some brains going. You just have no choice but to simply keep loving them and praying for the very best, that they will turn, connect with the Lord, and get their life squared away. Anybody here had that kind of experience? Yeah, most of us. We all know somebody. Well, keep that thought and that sense and that feeling with you, kind of through this message, because it helps us identify at least a tiny bit with what perhaps Jesus was going through. And I would ask, what do we really know about Jesus and his personal private life or his faith life? We know he was connected to God. We know that he prayed a lot. But do we know what kind of some of the day-to-day things he had done? Well, we're going to get to that. But first, Reverend Richard Swanson, who's a professor of religion at Augustana Sioux Falls, suggests that the first thing we need to do to understand today's gospel is that Jerusalem was the very center at that time of the entire world. And in the center of the world was the temple, which was in Jerusalem. And the precise center of the temple was the Holy of Holies. Now, if something is holy, we know that it takes your breath away. It's beyond magnificent. How could anyone miss that? And yet the Romans did. This magnificence that fits the Holy of Holies so well is in the middle of a huge teeming city full of business and trade and clamor and the military Romans and all the things that go along with all of that. But within the Holy of Holies, in the center of the synagogue, of the temple, was a dim, quiet place. Empty, actually, quite silent. Because the Holy of Holies, as drawn by Shane Cohen, an artist, was the place where God's finger came from heaven and touched the wild, chaotic world and held it still. It was a place of such catastrophic importance that it was simply not to be trifled with. Imagine that, if you can. According to some ancient texts, the priest would enter that very holy space, carry out whatever ritual acts to bring the world, so to speak, back into balance, and then would emerge and would speak the divine name to the waiting crowd. Now, according to the rabbis, the unpronounceable divine name we know as YHWH, and you can't pronounce it unless you insert syllables. The divine name is linked to the mercy attribute of God. So in a way, however you pronounce the name of God, it means mercy and grace. And it also connects to the word that God spoke simply to create the entire world. Now, when the priest emerged from the Holy of Holies, he would sort of, in a manner of speaking, recreate the world by simply naming the name of God out loud, whose name is mercy. Now, I think that's a little hard for us to imagine the power and the importance of that, because there are many of us who just sort of casually take the Lord's name in vain and oftentimes don't even realize we're doing it. It's become such a habit. But in the middle of Jerusalem, this crossroads of quiet and chaos and clamor is essential to this scene. This crossroads of huge opposing ideas leads to a second thing to watch for: the way that Jesus speaks about Jerusalem. Jesus said, Jerusalem, the center of all of this holiness, Jerusalem kills the prophets. They may well imagine that Jesus, because he seems to be a rabble-rouser, is setting up a basic conflict between a religion centered on Jerusalem and one centered on the Messiah. But it's not so. We also remember that in Luke's story, Jesus comes from a family, and I don't know that we think about this other than when he went with his parents to Jerusalem and then was in the temple and sort of got lost. They came for this pilgrimage to Jerusalem every single year to this festival. It was the usual common thing for them to do, because this Jerusalem is also the center of Christ's own faith, even though God is with him all the time. Now, it would be good to remember that Jesus is very much like us. That's been established, and yet Jesus is not like us sitting here at all like us. He is a Jew of the first century, and Jerusalem is for him the center of the world. When Jesus says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, he is grieving for a city that he loves. And finally, watch out for the Pharisees, not because they are representatives of a rejected, formalized religion, but because the Pharisees in this scene are actually protecting Jesus. Look out, they warn. Herod is planning to kill you. That is so different than how we almost always read or think about the Pharisees. Now, maybe it's also good to remember that the Pharisees spent their very lives studying and learning about God. And the Pharisees generally held themselves separate, way apart from the Roman culture and certain the Roman military. They extended the holiness of the Holy of Holies even to Jewish dinner tables because they recognized the danger posed by Roman chaos and violence, which we know was extreme. Now, though the Sadducees, and we often hear Pharisees and Sadducees spoken in the same breath because they were all workers in the synagogue and the temples, but though the Sadducees were tough on Jesus, and so were many of the Pharisees, not all the Pharisees were negative toward him. They didn't want Jesus hurt. And the verses that we read about these Pharisees this morning warn Jesus specifically about Herod. Jesus probably doesn't really need to be warned. He probably already knows. He knows that Herod is a fox, a sneaking predator. And in the scene for this Sunday, the Pharisees emerge as allies and protectors of the Messiah. What do you suppose Jesus and the Pharisees' conversation might have been like? In maybe a little bit of today's vernacular, would Jesus have said something like this? After you go, tell that fox I'm a little busy right now. And the scene plays best if the allies laugh a little at this, and then they might say, okay, we'll do that very thing, they say, as soon as we see old Foxy Pants, which will be like never. Could that have been like the conversation, only in their vernacular? When Jesus then laments over the fall of Jerusalem, the allies join him. The Pharisees loved the city at the center of the world as much as Jesus did, and they hated what Rome and the collaborationist Sadducees had made of it. Now we turn from this history to a reminder for ourselves. I would like us to read together, go back to your celebrate, go back to the prayer of the day, and we aren't going to read all of it. We'll only go to the comma that follows the word mercy. So we'll read up to and through the word mercy. Ready? God of the covenant, in the mystery of the cross, you promise everlasting life to the world. Gather all peoples in your arms and shelter us with your mercy. Now we turn back just for a moment to verse 34 in our gospel. In the midst of all this turmoil of Jesus knowing what is coming, Jesus still would gather Jerusalem's children in verse 34 as a hen gathers her brood under her wings. What an extraordinary metaphor. Following Christ and living in God is simply the better way. Jesus comparing being the mothering hen who protects her chicks is deepened by Jesus calling Herod a fox. As Barbara Brown Taylor writes, a hen is rather a peculiar choice for Jesus' illustration because a hen is about as far from a fox as you can get. But a mother hen will resolutely stand firm to shield her chicks from the fox who wants to snatch them. If he wants to get them, the fox will have to kill her first. At the end of Lent, we remember that the fox did indeed kill the mother hen on a hill outside of Jerusalem, and the chicks scattered. But we look to Easter, when the hen will rise from the empty tomb to gather all her chicks and even little kittens under her wings once more. It is important we recognize Jesus' lament over Jerusalem It shows perhaps how little we really know of the fine details of Jesus' life. Jesus could never have spoken like this unless he had offered his love to Jerusalem far more many times than once. We can recognize it is a bitter tragedy to give one's heart to someone only to have it broken. We can identify with Jesus in this situation and he with us. It is a bitter tragedy to give one's heart entirely to someone only to have it broken. That is what happened to Jesus in Jerusalem. And still, Jesus came to them, and Jesus comes to us, and still, at times, we still reject him by some of the choices we make. To reject God's love is in the end most likely to be in peril of his wrath, and yet we know his name as mercy and as grace. And we depend wholly, thoroughly, and completely on God's grace right in the midst of our own stubborn willfulness, to be our own person, to be independent, to do it our own way. And yet we know so well the words of our dear Martin Luther, who struggled also with his own stubbornness, his own willfulness. And he wrote, "Faith is a living, daring confidence in God's grace, so sure and so certain that the believer would stake his life on it 1,000 times." In spite of our living in a fallen world with its own share of foxes, we take heart in knowing the Messiah has more allies, even among the Pharisees, than we could ever imagine. And so do we have so many allies, and especially in Jesus Christ. So we run together beneath Jesus and God's loving wings, recognizing that that is how we prepare to welcome the one coming in the name of God, whose very name is mercy and grace. Amen.